The first mistake people make when dealing with difficult or toxic behavior is reacting before they understand what they are dealing with. One unpleasant comment, one disagreement, or one bad day does not automatically define a person. People have moments of stress, frustration, and poor judgment. The real danger appears when a behavior becomes a repeated pattern and you continue treating each incident as if it were isolated. This is why observation must come before reaction. When someone repeatedly creates conflict, shifts blame, disrespects boundaries, manipulates conversations, or tries to make you feel responsible for their emotions, don't immediately rush into confrontation. First, step back and observe. Ask yourself what is actually happening rather than what you fear might be happening. There is a difference between a fact and an interpretation. The fact might be that someone repeatedly interrupts you. The interpretation might be that they secretly want to make you feel insignificant. The behavior is observable. The intention may not be. If you confuse the two, you can easily create a conflict based on assumptions rather than reality. Strong judgment begins with separating what you know from what you suspect. Watch the pattern. Does the person behave this way with everyone or only with you? Does the behavior happen occasionally or does it happen repeatedly? When you calmly communicate a concern, do they listen and adjust or do they immediately attack, deny, or shift responsibility? Do they make mistakes and take responsibility or does every problem somehow become someone else's fault? These questions reveal far more than one dramatic interaction. A person who makes a mistake and sincerely tries to correct it is very different from someone who repeatedly causes the same problem and refuses to acknowledge it. This is why patterns matter. Imagine someone who occasionally forgets to respond to a message. That could mean almost anything. They may be busy, they may have forgotten, they may not have seen it. There is not enough information to create a conclusion. But imagine a repeated pattern where they only contact you when they need something, disappear when you need support, ignore reasonable boundaries, and then become upset when you stop making yourself available. Now you have more information. You don't need to label them. You need to recognize the pattern. Labels can sometimes become distractions because once you decide that someone is toxic, you may start interpreting everything they do through that label. Observation is more useful than labeling because it keeps you focused on behavior. The goal is not to diagnose people. The goal is to make better decisions. This distinction protects you from another common mistake, trying to change someone before you have understood them. You may believe that if you explain yourself more clearly, they will suddenly become reasonable. You may think that if you show enough patience, they will eventually stop creating conflict. Sometimes people change. But you cannot build your strategy around the assumption that someone will become different simply because you want them to. Judge patterns, not promises. Pay attention to what happens after apologies. Does the behavior actually change? Pay attention to what happens after boundaries are communicated. Does the person respect them? Pay attention to what happens when they don't get what they want. Their response under disappointment can reveal a great deal about their character and emotional habit. This is not about becoming suspicious of everyone. It is about becoming difficult to manipulate. A person who observes carefully does not need to make immediate judgments. They gather information, they notice inconsistencies, they watch how someone treats people who cannot offer them anything. They observe how they respond to disagreement. They notice whether kindness disappears when they are denied something. Behavior is information, and information creates choices. Without observation, you may respond emotionally to every provocation. With observation, you can begin choosing which situations deserve your attention. Sometimes the correct response will be direct communication. Sometimes it will be a boundary. Sometimes it will be reducing contact. And sometimes the best response will simply be not engaging, but you cannot choose wisely until you know what you are dealing with. This is why emotional control and observation are connected. When you become emotionally overwhelmed, your perception becomes narrower. You focus on the insult instead of the pattern. You focus on the latest argument instead of the history behind it. You focus on proving that you are right instead of asking what response will actually improve the situation. Pause long enough to see the bigger picture. Ask yourself, is this a single incident or is this a repeated pattern? Have they shown a willingness to change? Does this relationship consistently create problems? Am I responding to facts or am I reacting to an assumption? These questions create distance between stimulus and response, and that distance is valuable. It gives you time to choose rather than react. There is another subtle form of observation that many people overlook. Observe yourself. Notice what certain people bring out in you. Do you constantly feel pressured to defend yourself? Do you become anxious before interacting with them? Do you repeatedly abandon your own boundaries just to keep the peace? Do you find yourself acting in ways that don't reflect your normal values? Your own reactions can provide information about the relationship. That doesn't automatically mean the other person is responsible for every emotion you experience. You are responsible for understanding your own feelings, but recurring discomfort can be a signal that something deserves closer examination. You don't have to make a dramatic decision immediately. You can observe, you can create space, you can communicate, you can see what happens next. And once the pattern becomes clear, your response becomes much more deliberate. The smartest way to deal with difficult people is not to become better at fighting them. It is to become better at recognizing patterns before they pull you into unnecessary conflict. Observe first, understand the pattern, then choose your response. The most dangerous thing about toxic behavior is not the words themselves. It is the emotional reaction those words can create inside you. A person can say something provocative in seconds, but if you spend the next several hours replaying it, arguing with it in your mind, or trying to prove that they were wrong, they have gained far more influence over you than their original comment deserved. This is why emotional control becomes the second great principle of dealing with difficult people. When someone knows exactly which buttons to push, your reaction can become predictable. They criticize and you defend yourself. They provoke and you become angry. They accuse and you begin explaining. They withdraw and you chase them for an explanation. The pattern repeats because the emotional reaction gives the situation momentum. The answer is not to become emotionless. You will feel anger, you will feel disappointment, you will sometimes feel hurt or frustrated. Those emotions are part of being human. The skill is learning that feeling something does not require you to immediately act on it. There is a space between what happens and what you do next. Protect that space. Imagine someone makes a deliberately irritating comment during a conversation. Your first impulse may be to respond immediately. You may feel that if you don't answer, you are allowing them to win. But this is where emotional thinking can trap you. You begin treating every interaction as a competition in which the fastest response is the strongest response. It isn't. Sometimes the strongest response is the most deliberate one. Pause. Breathe to what was actually said. Decide whether it deserves an answer. That pause may last only a few seconds, but those seconds can completely change the outcome. When you react instantly, the other person's behavior controls the timing of your response. When you pause, you reclaim that timing. You are no longer simply responding to their emotional state. You are choosing your own. This is especially important when someone tries to pull you into an argument. They may raise their voice, exaggerate the situation, accuse you of things you didn't do, or change the subject whenever you answer their original point. If you allow their emotional intensity to determine your own, the conversation can quickly become chaotic. Lower the temperature instead of matching it. Speak more slowly. Use fewer words, focus on the specific issue. If necessary, say that you will continue the conversation when everyone can communicate respectfully. You do not need to mirror someone's anger to demonstrate that you are serious. In fact, matching aggression often gives the conflict exactly what it needs to continue. There is another reason emotional control matters. Anger can make you reveal too much. When people feel attacked, they often explain things they never intended to share. They reveal insecurities, they make accusations, they exaggerate, they say things that cannot be taken back. A moment of anger can create consequences that last much longer than the emotion itself. This is why learning to pause is not weakness, it is protection. Before you respond, ask yourself, what outcome do I actually want? Do you want to solve the problem? Do you want to clarify a misunderstanding? Do you need to establish a boundary? Do you need to leave the conversation? Or are you simply trying to make the other person feel bad because they made you feel bad? That final question can expose a great deal. Revenge may feel satisfying for a moment, but it rarely creates the outcome you actually need. If someone behaves badly and you respond by becoming equally destructive, the situation becomes a contest of reactions rather than a solution. You don't have to become the behavior you dislike. If someone is rude, you can remain respectful while being firm. If someone is manipulative, you can become more careful without becoming manipulative yourself. If someone tries to provoke you, you can refuse to give them the reaction they are seeking. This is not passivity, it is emotional discipline. And emotional discipline becomes easier when you stop taking every behavior personally. Someone else's anger may be about them. Someone else's insecurity may be about them. Someone else's need to dominate a conversation may reveal something about their own emotional habits. You don't have to carry every emotion that enters the room. Learn to distinguish between what belongs to you and what belongs to someone else. Your responsibility is your own behavior. You cannot control another person's mood, interpretation, or choices. You control whether you respond thoughtfully or impulsively. This is why silence can sometimes be useful, not as a punishment and not as a manipulation, but as a pause that prevents unnecessary escalation. If you don't know what to say, you don't have to fill the silence immediately. Give yourself time to think. A calm person has more options. They can listen, they can ask for clarification, they can disagree. They can set a boundary, they can end the conversation, they can seek help from someone appropriate if the situation becomes serious. An emotionally overwhelmed person often sees only one option: react. That is why emotional regulation creates freedom. There is also a deeper form of emotional control that comes from not needing every interaction to end with you being understood. Sometimes you can explain yourself clearly and the other person will still disagree. Sometimes they will interpret your actions differently. Sometimes they may never accept your perspective. You can tolerate that. Your self-respect does not depend on winning every conversation. When you stop demanding that everyone understand you, you become much harder to provoke. You can hear criticism without immediately collapsing into defensiveness. You can hear an insult without feeling obligated to return one. You can hear disagreement without treating it as an attack on your identity. That is emotional maturity. And over time, something changes. The people who rely on provoking reactions may discover that their usual tactics no longer work. The conversation becomes less dramatic because you refuse to provide unnecessary emotional fuel. Again, the goal is not to control the other person. The goal is to remain in control of yourself, because the moment another person's anger determines your behavior, they have gained influence over you. Stay calm enough to choose your response, and you take that influence back. One of the most exhausting mistakes you can make with a difficult person is believing that you must make them understand you. You explain your intentions, you clarify your words, you give examples, you defend your decisions. Then, when they still disagree, you explain again, hoping that the next explanation will finally create understanding. But there are situations where more explanation creates less peace. Some people are genuinely trying to understand you. They ask questions because they want clarity. They listen when you answer. They are willing to reconsider their assumptions when new information appears. With these people, communication is valuable, but there are others who are not searching for understanding. They are searching for leverage. They take your explanation and turn it into another argument. They use your words against you. They ignore the parts that answer their concerns and focus on whatever can keep the conflict alive. You answer one accusation and another appears. You clarify one misunderstanding and suddenly you are expected to defend something completely different. If you continue participating, the conversation has no natural ending. This is where you must recognize the difference between communication and endless justification. Communication has a purpose. It seeks clarity, resolution, understanding, or a reasonable agreement. Endless justification seeks approval from someone who may have already decided not to give it. That distinction can save you enormous emotional energy. Imagine someone accuses you of being selfish because you said no to a request. You explain why you couldn't help. Instead of acknowledging your explanation, they say you are making excuses. You explain further. They question your priorities. You defend those priorities. Then they bring up something you did months ago. Notice what has happened. The original issue has disappeared. You are now defending your entire character. This is how some conflicts become endless. The more you defend, the larger the battlefield becomes. A better approach is to return to the actual issue. You can say what happened. You can clarify what you meant. You can acknowledge your part if you made a mistake, and then you can stop. You don't have to submit yourself to an endless trial where another person keeps inventing new charges. This does not mean refusing accountability. In fact, a strong person should be capable of admitting mistakes quickly. If you were wrong, say so. If your behavior hurt someone, listen and take responsibility. If you misunderstood a situation, correct yourself. But accountability is different from surrendering your self-respect. You can accept responsibility without accepting every accusation. You can apologize for a specific action without agreeing that you are a terrible person. You can clarify your position without demanding that the other person approve of it. This is where emotional maturity becomes visible. People who are insecure often believe that disagreement means they have failed. They need everyone to understand their intentions. They need everyone to see them as reasonable. They need the other person to say you're right. But life does not work that way. You can act with good intentions and still be misunderstood. You can make a reasonable decision and still disappoint someone. You can establish a healthy boundary and still be called selfish by someone who benefited from you having no boundaries. The question is not whether everyone approves. The question is whether your behavior aligns with your values and responsibilities. Once you understand this, you stop explaining yourself compulsively. You become more precise. Instead of giving 10 reasons, give the one that actually matters. Instead of defending every detail, address the central issue. Instead of responding to every accusation, decide which points are relevant. Instead of arguing about your character, focus on the behavior being discussed. This makes communication clearer and prevents unnecessary escalation. There is also power in allowing someone to misunderstand you temporarily. Not every misunderstanding requires immediate correction. Sometimes time and consistent behavior will reveal more than an argument ever could. If someone believes you are unreliable, you don't necessarily need a long speech about how dependable you are. Be dependable. If someone believes you lack discipline, you don't need to announce your discipline. Let your habits demonstrate it. If someone questions your intentions, explain when necessary, but don't spend your life trying to control their interpretation of you. People are entitled to their opinions. You are responsible for your choices. This becomes especially important when someone repeatedly tries to pull you into emotional debates. They may use phrases designed to make you feel guilty or defensive. They may suggest that if you really cared, you would prove it by doing what they want. They may turn your boundary into evidence that you don't care. Don't accept the false choice. Caring about someone does not mean agreeing with everything they demand. Respecting someone does not mean surrendering your boundaries. Listening to someone does not mean accepting every conclusion they reach. You can remain calm while disagreeing. And sometimes the most powerful sentence is simply, "I understand that you see it differently." That sentence does not surrender your position. It ends the unnecessary struggle over whose perception must dominate. Of course, there are situations where communication must continue. Serious misunderstandings, important responsibilities, family matters, school or workplace concerns, and safety-related issues may require appropriate discussion and support. The goal is not to avoid difficult conversations. The goal is to avoid turning every difficult conversation into a battle for approval. Choose your conversations carefully. Ask yourself whether the person in front of you is actually listening. If they are, communicate. If they are not, repeating yourself may not change anything. And when you recognize that the conversation has become an endless demand for justification, step back. Your worth does not increase because someone finally admits that you were right. Your character is demonstrated by how you live, not by how successfully you argue. You don't need to convince everyone of who you are. Sometimes the strongest explanation is the life you consistently live. A boundary is not a weapon. It is not a threat, an attempt to control someone, or a dramatic announcement designed to make another person afraid. A boundary is a clear decision about what you will participate in and what you will do when a certain behavior continues. Once you understand this difference, dealing with difficult people becomes much simpler. Many people struggle with boundaries because they think saying no makes them rude. They fear disappointing others. They fear being misunderstood. They fear that if they become firm, someone will accuse them of being selfish. So they tolerate small violations again and again until frustration becomes resentment. Then eventually they explode. The problem was not that they needed stronger anger. The problem was that they needed clearer boundaries earlier. A healthy boundary allows you to communicate before resentment takes over. You don't have to wait until you are furious. You don't have to insult anyone. You don't have to threaten them. You simply state what you are comfortable with and what you will do if the behavior continues. For example, instead of saying, "You always disrespect me and I'm not going to tolerate you anymore," you can communicate more clearly. "I'm willing to discuss this, but I won't continue the conversation if we are insulting each other." Notice the difference. One statement attacks the person's character. The other defines your participation. That distinction matters because you cannot control another person's behavior. You can only control what you choose to do in response to it. You cannot force someone to speak respectfully, but you can decide not to remain in a conversation that has become abusive or unproductive. You cannot force someone to respect your time, but you can stop making yourself endlessly available. You cannot force someone to communicate honestly, but you can decide what level of trust you are willing to give them. This is where boundaries become powerful. They move your attention away from controlling others and toward controlling your own choices. A boundary also needs consistency. If you tell someone that you will leave a conversation when it becomes insulting, but then remain for another hour arguing, your words lose credibility. The other person learns that your boundary is negotiable whenever they push hard enough. You don't need to become harsh, you need to become predictable. If you say you will end a conversation when it becomes disrespectful, end it calmly when that point is reached. If you say you cannot participate in something, don't repeatedly change your answer because someone pressures you. If you need space, communicate that clearly and take it. Consistency teaches people how to interact with you. But remember, a boundary is not a demand that another person behave exactly as you want. You can say you must never disagree with me, but that is not a healthy boundary. A better boundary concerns your own actions. If the conversation becomes disrespectful, I will step away. One attempts to control another person, the other controls your participation. This is a critical difference. There is also no requirement to explain every boundary in exhausting detail. If you have already communicated your position clearly, repeating the same explanation 10 different ways may only create more opportunities for argument. You can be respectful and brief. No, I can't do that. I'm not comfortable with that. I've made my decision. We can talk about this when we're both calm. Those statements may feel simple, but simplicity is often useful when someone is trying to pull you into an emotional debate. The more defensive you become, the more material the other person has to argue with. A clear boundary leaves less room for unnecessary negotiation. Of course, boundaries do not guarantee that everyone will respect them. Some people may become angry, some may accuse you of changing, some may tell you that you are selfish. Some may attempt to test whether you really mean what you said. This is where consistency becomes essential. If your boundary disappears the moment someone becomes upset, it was never really a boundary. It was a request, and there is nothing wrong with making a request. But you must know the difference. A request says, I would like you to do this. A boundary says, if this continues, here's what I will do to protect my participation time or well-being. That distinction gives you clarity. It also prevents unnecessary revenge. When someone crosses a boundary, you don't need to punish them. You don't need to humiliate them. You don't need to create a public confrontation. You simply follow through with the action you already decided upon. The distance can be a consequence. Ending a conversation can be a consequence. Reducing contact can be a consequence. Seeking support from a trusted adult, school staff, workplace supervisor, or another appropriate person can be a consequence when a situation becomes serious or unsafe. The purpose is not to hurt the other person. The purpose is to protect yourself and maintain a healthier environment. There is another important lesson. Boundaries should apply to yourself as well. Sometimes the difficult person in your life is not the only source of the problem. You may have habits of over-explaining, people-pleasing, or saying yes when you really mean no. If you constantly abandon your own needs to avoid disappointing others, no external boundary can completely solve the problem. You have to practice honoring your own decisions. Start small. Say no when you genuinely cannot help. Take time before agreeing to something. Don't promise what you cannot deliver. Don't continue conversations that have become disrespectful. Don't allow guilt to automatically change a reasonable decision. Each time you practice this, your confidence grows. Eventually, you realize that saying no does not make you cruel. Creating distance does not make you heartless. Protecting your time does not make you selfish. You are simply accepting responsibility for how you participate in relationships. And that is the heart of a strong boundary. You don't need to control people to protect yourself. You need to communicate clearly, act consistently, and be willing to step away when your standards are repeatedly ignored. A calm boundary can accomplish what an angry confrontation never will. It makes your position clear without surrendering control of yourself. One of the most valuable things you can protect in life is your attention. People often think their time is their greatest resource, but attention determines where that time goes. You can have an entire day available to you and still accomplish almost nothing if your mind is constantly occupied by arguments, gossip, resentment, and other people's problems. This is why dealing with toxic people is not only about what you say to them, it is also about what you allow them to occupy inside your mind. A difficult person does not necessarily need to be physically present to influence you. They can remain in your thoughts long after the conversation ends. You replay what they said. You imagine what you should have answered. You wonder whether they were trying to insult you. You think about what you will say next time. Without realizing it, someone who may have spent only 5 minutes interacting with you has occupied hours of your attention. That is a hidden cost. And strong people learn to recognize it. You cannot control every person you encounter, but you can become more selective about how much access they receive to your attention. Not everyone deserves unlimited explanations, immediate responses, or emotional investment. This does not mean ignoring legitimate responsibilities. If someone is part of your family, school, workplace, or another important environment, you may have to communicate with them. The goal is not to disappear from every difficult situation. The goal is to stop giving unnecessary emotional energy to interactions that produce nothing useful. Start by noticing what consumes your attention, which conversations repeatedly become arguments, which people constantly bring you into gossip, which interactions leave you feeling confused or exhausted, which situations make you abandon important priorities simply because someone demands immediate attention. These questions help you identify where your energy is leaking, then make practical adjustments. You don't have to respond instantly to every message. You don't have to participate in every conversation. You don't have to answer every accusation. You don't have to explain every decision. And you certainly don't have to become involved in gossip simply because someone invites you into it. There is enormous freedom in realizing that not every invitation requires your participation. Someone says, "Did you hear what happened?" You can choose not to engage. Someone wants you to criticize another person. You can change the subject. Someone tries to pull you into an argument that has nothing to do with your goals. You can step away. These decisions may seem small, but repeated daily, they change the quality of your life. Your attention becomes more available for meaningful things, learning, creating, practicing, building relationships that actually matter, taking care of your responsibilities, developing your skills, thinking about your future. This is why protecting your attention is not simply about avoiding negative people. It is about deciding what deserves your mental space. Imagine your attention as a limited room. Every person, problem, notification, argument, and distraction you allow inside takes up space. If the room becomes crowded with meaningless noise, there is less room for important ideas. You cannot think clearly when your mind is constantly occupied by conflict. Sometimes you need to create distance simply to think again. This may mean spending less time around certain people. It may mean keeping conversations focused on practical matters. It may mean refusing to discuss private topics with someone who repeatedly turns them into gossip. It may mean limiting how often you respond to unnecessary messages. None of this requires hostility. You can become less available without becoming cruel. You can be polite without becoming accessible to everything. You can respect someone while maintaining distance. This is where many people become confused. They believe that if they stop giving unlimited attention, they are being rude. But attention is not a moral obligation. You are allowed to decide where your time and mental energy go. At the same time, don't become so protective of your energy that you reject every difficult conversation. Growth sometimes requires uncomfortable conversations. A trusted friend may tell you something you don't want to hear. A teacher, mentor, parent, or responsible adult may challenge a decision because they care about your development. Discomfort alone does not make an interaction toxic. The question is what the interaction produces. Does it help you understand something? Does it encourage responsibility? Does it lead toward a solution? Does it challenge you respectfully? Or does it repeatedly create confusion, humiliation, pressure, and unnecessary conflict? Learn to distinguish discomfort from destruction. That distinction prevents you from using protecting my energy as an excuse to avoid accountability. There is another powerful habit. Stop monitoring people who consistently disturb your peace. If you have already decided to create distance, don't spend your time constantly checking what they are doing, what they are saying, or whether they are talking about you. Distance becomes meaningless if your attention remains attached. Let them live their life. You live yours. You don't need to know whether they noticed your absence. You don't need to know whether they regret their behavior. You don't need to know whether they are discussing you. Your progress does not require their reaction. This is one of the deepest forms of emotional independence. When your attention returns to your own life, you begin noticing how much energy was previously being wasted. You may suddenly have more patience, more creativity, more focus, more time for the people who genuinely care about you. And perhaps most importantly, you begin becoming more selective. You stop asking, how do I make this person treat me differently? You start asking, how much access should this person have to me? That question puts the responsibility back where it belongs. You cannot control another person's personality. You can control your access, you can control your response, you can control your time, you can control where you place your attention. And when you protect those things consistently, toxic behavior loses much of its ability to dominate your life. Guard your attention carefully, because whatever repeatedly occupies your mind eventually shapes the direction of your life. There is a point in dealing with difficult people when you must stop asking, how can I make this person understand? And begin asking a more important question. Is this relationship worth continuing in the same way? This is where wisdom becomes more valuable than persistence. Not every conflict can be solved. Not every misunderstanding can be repaired. Not every person will respond to patience, communication, or reasonable boundaries. Sometimes the smartest decision is not to win the argument, but to reduce your participation in it. Walking away does not mean you are weak. It means you understand that your time, attention, and peace have value. Many people remain trapped in unhealthy interactions because they believe leaving means losing. They want the final word. They want an apology. They want the other person to admit what they did. They want everyone to understand their side of the story. So they continue the conflict long after the useful part of the conversation has ended. But what if the victory you are looking for is not available? What if the other person has no intention of understanding? What if every explanation simply creates another argument? At some point, continuing becomes a choice to remain inside the same cycle. This is why disengagement can be powerful. Disengagement is not the same as silent punishment or manipulation. It is not about ignoring someone to make them anxious. It is not about creating jealousy or trying to force them to chase you. It is simply the decision to stop investing energy into an interaction that is no longer constructive. You can say, I don't think this conversation is productive right now. You can take a break. You can move your attention elsewhere. You can reduce unnecessary contact. And if the relationship repeatedly becomes harmful despite reasonable efforts to communicate, you can seek appropriate support and create greater distance. The important thing is that the decision comes from clarity rather than revenge. Revenge keeps you psychologically connected to the person. Disengagement helps you move forward. There is a subtle difference between the two. If you walk away hoping the other person will suffer, you are still thinking about them. If you walk away because you have decided that the situation no longer deserves your energy, your attention begins returning to your own life. That is freedom. Of course, walking away is not always simple. Some people cannot completely avoid difficult individuals because they share a school, workplace, family environment, team, or another important setting. In those situations, the goal may not be total separation. The goal can be limited, respectful, practical interaction, keep conversations focused, avoid unnecessary arguments, communicate clearly, maintain reasonable boundaries, documenting important interactions when appropriate, seek help from trusted adults, supervisors, counselors, or other responsible people when a situation becomes serious or unsafe. You don't have to handle every difficult situation alone. There is also a difference between walking away from a toxic pattern and abandoning someone who is simply going through a difficult period. Everyone makes mistakes. Everyone has moments of frustration. A healthy relationship can survive disagreement because both people are willing to listen, take responsibility, and make adjustments. The question is whether there is a genuine possibility of improvement. If someone makes a mistake and sincerely changes their behavior, there may be something worth preserving. If someone repeatedly crosses boundaries, refuses accountability, and turns every attempt at communication into another conflict, the pattern deserves a different response. Don't confuse endless tolerance with kindness. Sometimes continued access only allows the same cycle to continue. This is why your previous lessons matter. First, observe the pattern, then control your emotional reaction. Stop over-explaining yourself. Establish clear boundaries. Protect your time and attention. And after all of that, evaluate whether continued engagement is actually helping. If it is, continue constructively. If it isn't, step back. That sequence prevents impulsive decisions. You are not walking away because you are angry in the moment. You are walking away because you have gathered enough information to make a reasonable decision. There is great strength in reaching that point. You no longer need to prove anything. You don't need to defeat anyone. You don't need to make someone regret their behavior. You simply decide where your energy belongs. And once you make that decision, honor it. Don't walk away today and return tomorrow because you are lonely. Don't create distance and then spend the entire day checking whether the other person noticed. Don't leave the argument physically while continuing it mentally for weeks. If you choose distance, Let your mind move forward too. This is where solitude becomes useful again. After stepping away from unnecessary conflict, you can return your attention to your own development. Read, learn, practice. Build relationships with people who treat you with respect. Spend time with those who encourage healthy growth. Give yourself space to recover your perspective. The goal is not to become someone who never trusts again. The goal is to become someone who trusts more wisely. You learn from patterns without becoming cynical. You protect yourself without becoming cruel. You create boundaries without becoming controlling. You walk away without needing revenge. And you remain open to healthy relationships without allowing unhealthy ones to dominate your life. That is the real meaning of power in dealing with difficult people. Power is not making another person obey you. It is refusing to surrender control of your own behavior, attention, and choices. Sometimes the smartest response is a conversation. Sometimes it is a boundary. Sometimes it is silence. And sometimes it is simply walking away and refusing to carry the conflict with you. You don't have to defeat every difficult person. Sometimes the greatest victory is choosing a life in which they no longer occupy your attention.